is number 3. This one's just a little bit trickier because instead of being set equal to 0, it's set equal to -2. And so we have to ask, can we really have, if I could write it as products equal to -2, is there only one, does one of the numbers have to be a -2, or are there other possibilities? And I can think, well, I could have a +2 and a -1 that multiply to give me -2. And if that doesn't convince you, I can also come up with some fractions. So I could have like -10/2 times 1, no, I don't know. Let's write a couple things down. So I can come up with a bunch of things that equal -2. So I could have -1 times 2, that's a -2. I could have 1 times -2, that's a -2. I could have 10 times -1/5, that should equal -2. And I can go on with fractions. So I could come up with a bunch of examples of different products that will give me -2. That's not the case when you have it set to 0, because if it's set to 0, you know one of those two has to be a 0. There's no other way to get a 0 for a product. Here, I don't know that. So what I have to do is come back to my problem and say, well, -2 doesn't help me at all. Can I make it set equal to 0? And see if we can do that. So what I want to do is add this 2 to both sides. And I don't see any like terms with it on the left, so I'm just ending up with x squared minus 3x plus 2. And now on the right, those canceled and I have just a 0 left. Now I'm to the point where I can just factor the left-hand side, set each factor to 0, and proceed. So let's look at the sum should be -3. The product should be a 1 times a 2 or a +2. And then for a product of 2, there's only a couple ways to get that. I could have 2 times 1, or I could have -2 times -1. So if I have 2 times 1, that'll give me 2. When I add it, it gives me a +3. If I have -2 times -1, negative times negative will give me a positive. And then when I add them, I do get a -3. So this is the pair that I need to use. And I'll substitute it in for that -3x. So I have x squared minus 2x minus 1x plus 2 equals 0. Now remember, I like you to check to make sure that your two terms in the middle add up to give you what you started with. So -2x minus x, that does give me -3x. So I've double checked myself right there. Now, since I have 4 terms, I don't want to combine them, even though I was checking by combining them. I do want to leave them separated so I can use factor by grouping. So for the first 2 terms, I'm looking, what can I factor out? Well, I see an x on each term, so I'll factor that out. So x times, I'll have to multiply by x to get an x squared. And then x times what gives me -2x. I think that's a -2. So I can double check. X times x gives me x squared. X times -2 gives me -2x. Last pair of terms, I have a -1x plus 2. And I can see here, I'd really like to be able to match with an x minus 2. So maybe I can just pull out a -1. -1 times what will give me a -1x. And that'll just be an x. So -1 times x is -1x. And then -1 times what gives me a 2. Well, I know I'm going to need a 2 on there, and I'm thinking about the sign. So negative times what will give me a positive? Well, that's got to be a negative. So negative times negative is a positive, and then set to 0. Now I'm looking for a factor in common, and I can see that I have this x minus 2 that matches exactly because we worked on it, right? And so I have x minus 2 as a factor in common, and I want to see what do I have to multiply x minus 2 by to get this first term here, and the answer is x. And then what do I have to multiply x minus 2 by to get this last term here, and the answer is a -1. Set that to 0. Now I'm ready to use the zero factor property, set each factor to 0, and then solve your little equations. So here I'll add 2 to both sides, and I end up with x equals a +2. Here I'll add 1 to both sides, and I'll have x equals a +1. So I've got two solutions, a +2 or a +1. Let's do a quick check. So if my x equals 2, then I'm plugging in a 2, so I'll have 2 squared minus 3 times 2 equals -2, and I want to check if that's equivalent. So 2 squared gives me 4, -3 times 2 is a -6, and is that equal to a -2? So 4 minus 6 is -2, and that does equal -2 on the right. So that one checks out. Let's check the other one. X equals a +1. So I have 1 squared minus 3 times 1 equals a -2. Is that true? 1 squared is 1. -3 times +1 will be -3. And I want to know if that is a -2. And +1 plus -3 is a -2. So that does equal a -2 on the right. So that one checks out as well.